Blood drips from spurs as a lone horseman pushes his stallion beyond exhaustion through the brutal Wyoming winter of 1875. Miles away, Sarah Mitchell stares at her reflection, her wedding dress feeling like a burial shroud. Tomorrow she'll be handed to Clayton Blackwood, a man whose mere name makes hardened outlaws tremble. They say he's killed 3 wives already, each death dismissed as a tragic accident. But through the howling wind comes the thunder of desperate hooves. Jake Harrison has crossed 5 states and shot his way through 2 posses, carrying a bullet wound and an unbreakable promise. He has until sunrise to prevent the woman he loves from becoming another of Blackwood's victims. But will his blood-stained rescue attempt save Sarah or condemn them both? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special. For you, Sarah Mitchell's trembling fingers traced the delicate engravings on her mother's wedding locket, each swirl and flower a reminder of promises made and broken. In the candle-lit solitude of her bedroom, the silver felt cold against her skin, much like the future that awaited her at tomorrow's dawn. A Mitchell always honors their word. Her father's voice echoed in her mind, the same words he'd used when he'd announced her engagement to Clayton Blackwood, the same words that had sealed her fate 3 months ago. She moved to the window, pressing her forehead against the frost-kissed glass. Outside, snow fell in thick curtains, blanketing the Wyoming territory in unforgiving white. Somewhere in that vast emptiness lay the grave of the only man she'd ever truly loved, or so they'd told her. The locket clicked open, revealing the faded daguerreotype of her mother on her own wedding day, young and full of hope. Martha Mitchell's smile seemed different now, tinged with a sadness Sarah had never noticed before. How many nights had her mother sat exactly where she sat now, holding this same locket, carrying the weight of similar obligations? Miss Sarah, Emma, her younger sister, slipped into the room like a shadow. At 16, she was everything Sarah had once been. Bright-eyed, hopeful, untouched by the cruel mathematics of family honor and mounting debts. "Father's asking for you." Sarah closed the locket with a soft snap. "Of course he is." The hallway outside felt longer than usual, each step carrying her closer to another reminder of her duty. Family portraits lined the walls, generations of Mitchells staring down at her with eyes that seemed to judge her every hesitation. She found her father in his study, surrounded by the familiar scent of leather-bound ledgers and tobacco. Andrew Mitchell's once proud shoulders sagged beneath his worn jacket, his fingers absently turning the pages of account books that refused to balance. "Sarah." He didn't look up. Mr. Blackwood's man dropped off the final contract. "Everything's in order for tomorrow." The words struck her like physical blows. "Father, please, we've been through this." Finally, he met her gaze, and the defeat in his eyes hurt worse than any anger could have. "The bank's calling in our loans. Without this marriage, we lose everything. The ranch, the house, your mother's medical care, all of it." Sarah's fingers found the locket again. "And my life. What's that worth in your ledgers?" "Clayton Blackwood is a successful man," her father continued as if she hadn't spoken. "He can provide for you, protect you. In time, you might even love him." The laugh that escaped her throat sounded foreign to her own ears. "Like his other wives loved him? Tell me, Father, have you asked yourself why a man of his means has buried 3 wives in 10 years? Andrew Mitchell's face hardened. "Mind your tongue, girl. Accidents happen, especially out here. You can't believe every wild tale that what? That comes from people who've seen behind his polite smiles, who've heard the screams from his mansion at night." Sarah moved closer to her father's desk, placing her palms flat against the wooden surface. 2 weeks ago, I saw him. Beat a stable boy unconscious for dropping a saddle. He smiled the whole time, Father, smiled like he was enjoying afternoon tea. Her father's silence spoke volumes. He knew. Of course he knew. Everyone knew about Clayton Blackwood's cruelty, but money had a way of making people look the other way. of turning monsters into merely misunderstood men. "You have no proof of anything," he finally said, his voice barely a whisper. "And we have no choice. Your mother's condition is worsening. The treatments in Denver are our only hope, and they cost more than we can ever repay without help." Sarah felt the fight drain from her, replaced by a familiar numbness. Her mother's illness had been their curse for 3 years now, eating away at their savings, their hope, their choices. Each temporary improvement was followed by a deeper decline, each new treatment more expensive than the last. "If Jake were here," she started, but couldn't finish. Her father's expression softened slightly. "Jake Harrison was a good man, but he's gone, Sarah, and all the wishing in the world won't bring him back." The memory of Jake's laugh, of his strong hands and gentle heart, washed over her like a physical ache. They'd found his horse at the bottom of Miller's Gorge 2 years ago. Saddle empty, blood on the rocks. No body was ever recovered, but in the harsh reality of the frontier, that meant little. "Get some rest," her father said, already turning back to his ledgers. "Tomorrow's an important day." Sarah left the study, each step feeling heavier than the last. The locket seemed to burn against her chest, its weight a reminder of all the choices that had been made for her, all the dreams she was expected to sacrifice on the altar of family duty. In her room, Emma waited, perched on the edge of the bed like a worried bird. "I heard you arguing with father again," Sarah managed a weak smile. "Arguing implies there's still something left to say." Emma crossed to her, taking her hands. "There has to be another way. We could run, find work in one of the bigger towns. I'm old enough to help now, and you're smart enough to— And leave mother without care? Leave father to face Blackwood's anger alone?" Sarah shook her head. "Some cages are built from love, little sister. Those are the hardest ones to break." Outside, the snow continued to fall, each flake another second ticking away toward tomorrow's dawn. Sarah touched the locket one last time, saying a silent prayer to whatever God might be listening. Not for rescue, she'd stopped believing in that particular miracle long ago, but for strength. Strength to face whatever darkness awaited her in Clayton Blackwood's mansion. Strength to protect her family, even if it meant sacrificing herself. What she didn't know, couldn't know, was that somewhere in that swirling snow, a ghost was riding toward her, carrying with him the keys to her cage and a love that even death couldn't erase. Clayton Blackwood's mansion loomed against the grey morning sky like a predator, waiting to strike. Sarah sat rigid in the carriage as it wound up the snow-covered drive, her fingers clutching a small bundle of newspaper clippings hidden in her dress pocket. Emma had pressed them into her hands just before she left, her young face pale with worry. "Found these in Mr. Peterson's old newspaper office," she'd whispered. "You need to see them." Now, watching the mansion grow closer, Sarah could feel the weight of those clippings like lead against her heart. 3 obituaries, 3 tragic accidents, 3 wives who had entered these iron gates never to leave alive. The carriage stopped before massive oak doors. Before Sarah could reach for the handle, a servant appeared, a woman whose eyes seemed to hold equal measures of fear and pity. "Miss Mitchell," the woman said, her voice barely above a whisper. "Mr. Blackwood is expecting you in his study." The entrance hall stretched before her, a cathedral of dark wood and darker shadows. Crystal chandeliers caught the weak winter light, scattering it like broken dreams across marble floors. Every surface gleamed with obsessive perfection, yet something about the air felt wrong, stale, as if the house itself were holding its breath. "This way, miss." The servant, Martha, she'd introduced herself, led Sarah through corridors lined with hunting trophies. Dead eyes followed their progress, glass beads catching the light like tears. They passed a closed door, and Sarah heard what sounded like muffled sobbing. Martha quickened her pace, but not before Sarah caught her slight flinch. "The last Mrs. Blackwood's room," Martha murmured, almost inaudibly. "He keeps it locked, says it's to preserve her memory, but—" She fell silent as they approached the study. Sarah's fingers brushed the newspaper clippings again, remembering the eerily similar phrases in each obituary. Tragic accident, unfortunate, a fall, unexpected illness. Clayton Blackwood stood at a vast window, his broad back to the door. He was a large man, impeccably dressed in a black suit that seemed to absorb what little light reached him. At their entrance he turned, and Sarah fought to keep her expression neutral. He was handsome, in the way that dangerous things often are, sharp features, steel-grey eyes, and a smile that never quite reached those eyes. "My dear Sarah," he said, voice smooth as honey over broken glass. "Welcome to your new home." Her new prison, she thought, but forced herself to smile. "Mr. Blackwood, please, call me Clayton." He gestured to a delicate chair positioned before his massive desk. "Sit. We have details to discuss." As Sarah moved to the chair, her dress brushed against a cabinet, causing its door to swing slightly open. Inside, she caught a glimpse of more newspaper clippings, meticulously organized and annotated in a spidery hand. Not obituaries. Stories of financial ruin, of families destroyed, of fortunes mysteriously transferred. Blackwood closed the cabinet. With a sharp click, one develops certain interests living in such a small territory. The rise and fall of local fortunes can be quite fascinating. Sarah sat, her back straight as a blade. "Like my family's fortune." His smile widened fractionally. "Ah, direct. I admire that. Yes, your family's situation has been of particular interest to me. Your father's desperate attempts to save your mother, the mounting debts, the increasingly urgent letters from the bank." He leaned forward slightly. "Did you know he tried to sell the ranch 3 times? No buyers, of course. I made sure of that." The truth of it hit Sarah like a physical blow. "You engineered this, all of it." Engineered is such a harsh word. Blackwood moved around the desk, each step deliberate as a spider approaching its web. "I merely guided circumstances toward their optimal conclusion. Your father needed money. I needed a wife. A fair exchange, wouldn't you say? Wouldn't you? And your other wives. Were they fair exchanges too?" The temperature in the room seemed to drop. Blackwood's smile remained, but something shifted behind his eyes, something ancient and cold and hungry. "Accidents happen, my dear. Especially to wives who don't understand their place." He reached out, fingers brushing her cheek with terrifying gentleness. "But you're different, aren't you? You understand duty, honor, family obligation. You'll do anything to protect those you love. That's why I chose you." Sarah forced herself not to recoil from his touch. "And if I refuse, then I'll foreclose on your father's loans tomorrow. Your mother will die without her treatments. Your sister will be forced into service to pay the debts. Your father," he shrugged elegantly. "Well, men in despair often make tragic decisions. Another unfortunate accident, perhaps." The newspaper clippings burned in her pocket, each one a warning she could no longer ignore. This man didn't just kill wives. He destroyed entire families, feeding on their desperation like a vulture. "I understand," she said, each word tasting like ash. "Excellent." Blackwood returned to his desk, pulling out a thick contract. "Then let's discuss the wedding arrangements. I have some very specific requirements about how my wife should behave." Outside the study window, snow began to fall again, each flake another bar in the cage being built around her. Sarah thought of Jake, of his warm laugh and honest heart, and for the first time was grateful he wasn't alive to see what she'd become, a bargaining chip in a monster's game. What she couldn't know was that at that very moment, less than 30 miles away, the man she mourned was very much alive, and his horse's hooves were eating up the distance between them with desperate purpose. Jake Harrison's broken pocket watch hadn't ticked in exactly 2 years, its hands frozen at the moment. He should have died. The gold case was dented now, the crystal spiderwebbed with cracks, but he kept it close, a reminder that time could stop, but life went on. His horse stumbled in the deep snow, and Jake leaned forward, patting the stallion's lathered neck. "Easy, Thunder. We're almost there." The lie tasted bitter. They were still hours from the Mitchell ranch, and his mount was running on nothing but heart and desperate loyalty. Blood from the bullet graze along his ribs had frozen to his shirt, cracking with each movement. Blackwood's men had been waiting at Miller's Pass, just like they'd been waiting 2 years ago when they'd tried to kill him the first time. Jake touched the watch again, remembering that night. He'd been riding to ask Andrew Mitchell for Sarah's hand, his mother's ring burning a hole in his pocket. The ambush came without warning, 6 men emerging from the shadows, guns blazing. His horse had gone down, both of them tumbling into the gorge. He should have died there. Would have, if not for the Shoshone hunting party that found him, half dead and frozen, at the bottom of the canyon. They'd taken him in, healed him, kept him alive while fever and broken bones tried to claim him. By the time he could ride again, the world had moved on. The newspaper had reported his death, the Mitchell ranch had fallen on hard times, and Sarah had mourned him and tried to build a life without him. He'd spent the last 2 years working as a U.S. Marshal under a different name, tracking Blackwood's operation across 5 territories. The man wasn't just a murderer. He was the center of a web that stretched from Wyoming to Texas, destroying families and acquiring land through a combination of violence and financial manipulation. Thunder stumbled again, and this time Jake couldn't keep him from going to his knees. They'd been riding for 18 hours straight, stopping only long enough to change horses at friendly homesteads. But even the strongest horse had limits, and they'd passed them miles ago. "Come on, boy," Jake whispered, sliding from the saddle. Just a little further. The wind cut through his coat like knives, driving snow into any exposed skin. His right hand was nearly frozen around his Colt's grip. He hadn't holstered the weapon since the ambush 6 hours ago. Blackwood's men were still out there hunting him. They'd been more surprised than anything when their bullets hadn't finished him this time. The look on their faces when they recognized him had almost been worth the pain. "The dead man rides," one had screamed before Jake's bullet had silenced him forever. Let them fear him, let them think him a ghost. He'd earned that right with blood. And lost years. Jake led Thunder through the deepening snow, each step a battle against exhaustion and cold. The bullet wound throbbed in time with his heartbeat, a steady reminder that he was running out of time. The wedding was at dawn, less than 12 hours away. A wolf howled somewhere in the darkness, and Thunder's ears pricked forward. Jake knew the feeling. There was something primitive about this night, something that stripped away civilization and left only raw need and desperate purpose. He pulled the worn wanted poster from his coat, the one that had finally led him back here. It had been posted in a Denver saloon, Clayton Blackwood, offering $1,000 for information about Sarah Mitchell's troublesome family. Jake had known then that his time in the shadows was over. The investigation he'd been building against Blackwood would take too long. By the time the territorial courts moved, Sarah would be another tragic accident, another obituary in Blackwood's collection. No, this had to end the old way, with guns and courage and the kind of justice that didn't wait for judges. Thunder whinnied softly and Jake's head snapped up. Through the swirling snow, he caught a glimpse of lamplight, a farmhouse he recognized. The Collins place, if he'd kept his bearings right. Good people who'd helped him more than once in his martial work. "Almost there, boy," he said, this time meaning it. The Collins had fresh horses, and from their farm, it was only 4 hours' hard ride to the Mitchell ranch. He might even have time to clean his wounds, reload his guns, prepare properly for what was coming. The broken watch bounced against his chest as he moved forward. 2 years of planning, of building evidence, of tracking Blackwood's operation. All of it came down to the next few hours. He died once to protect Sarah. He was willing to do it again to save her. But this time, he intended to take Blackwood with him. The deed to the Mitchell ranch lay on the kitchen table like an open wound, its faded ink telling the story of 3 generations of family dreams. Sarah traced her grandfather's signature, remembering the stories of how he'd built this place with nothing but determination and raw hope. "He'd hate what we've become," she whispered to the empty kitchen. The morning light was still hours away, but sleep had become impossible, not with tomorrow's wedding looming like a hangman's noose. Emma's footsteps on the stairs broke the silence. Her sister appeared in her nightgown, looking younger than her 16 years. "I heard you down here. Couldn't sleep? Not with Mother crying again?" Sarah's heart clenched. Their mother's room was directly above the kitchen, and lately the sounds of her suffering had become harder to ignore. The laudanum barely touched her pain anymore, and the doctor's latest letter had been clear. Without the experimental treatment in Denver, she had months at best. "Father's with her?" Sarah asked, though she already knew the answer. Emma nodded, sliding into the chair across from her. "He's been drinking again. I found this hidden behind his ledgers." She pulled out a stack of papers, bank notices, final warnings, and threats of foreclosure. "It's worse than he told us, isn't it? The bank's not just threatening the ranch." Emma's voice trembled. "They're talking about pressing charges, something about misrepresented collateral. Father could go to jail." The pieces clicked into place with terrible clarity. This was why her father had agreed to Blackwood's proposal so quickly, not just for Mother's treatment, but to avoid prison, to protect what remained of the family's honor. "There's more." Emma pulled out another document, a copy of the ranch's deed with strange markings. "I found this in Father's study. These numbers, in the margins, they're dates when Blackwood bought up neighboring ranches. He's been surrounding us for years, Sarah, cutting off our water rights, blocking our cattle drives. Planning this all along," Sarah finished. The truth felt like ice in her veins. "He didn't just wait for us to fail, he made it happen." Heavy footsteps overhead made both sisters freeze. A moment later, Andrew Mitchell appeared in the doorway, his face haggard with exhaustion and guilt. "You should both be in bed," he said, but there was no authority in his voice anymore, just bone-deep weariness. Sarah held up the deed. "Were you ever going to tell us the truth?" Their father seemed to age years in seconds. He crossed to the cabinet where he kept his whiskey, hands shaking as he poured a measure. "What good would it have done? The choices don't change, don't they?" Sarah stood, anger finally breaking through her resignation. "You're giving me to a man who engineered our ruin, who's killed 3 wives, who can save your mother?" The whiskey glass shattered in his grip, sending amber liquid and blood dripping to the floor. "Who can keep me out of prison, keep this family's name from being dragged through the mud? You think I don't know what he is? What I'm doing to my own daughter?" The broken glass glittered in the lamplight like accusatory tears. Emma moved to help their father, but he waved her away. "I was supposed to protect this family," he continued, his voice raw. "Your grandfather built this place from nothing. I inherited it debt-free, with 1,000 head of cattle and water rights clear to the river. Now look at us. Look what I've done." Sarah watched blood drip from her father's clenched fist, each drop another weight added to her shoulders. "It wasn't just you. Blackwood planned this. Those markings Emma found. He's been playing this game for years, and winning. Her father's laugh was a broken thing. "He always wins, Sarah, that's why." He couldn't finish. "That's why you didn't fight harder," Sarah finished for him. "When he asked for my hand, when he presented his terms, you knew we were already beaten." The silence that followed was answer enough. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling windows that needed repair they couldn't afford. Somewhere in the darkness, their remaining cattle huddled against the cold. Their numbers too few to matter anymore. Emma's small hand found Sarah's, squeezing tight. There has to be another way, but looking at her father's defeated posture, at the blood slowly drying on his fingers, at the deed that represented generations of Mitchell pride now worth less than the paper it was printed on, Sarah knew there wasn't. Not anymore, not for any of them. What none of them knew was that fate and a presumed dead U.S. Marshal had other plans. plans that would turn their carefully arranged surrender into something very different before the next sunset. The marriage contract sprawled across the Mitchells' dining room table, its elaborate legal language a web of carefully crafted traps. Sarah stood behind her father's chair, each paragraph making her feel more like property being transferred than a bride to be wed. Clayton Blackwood sat opposite them, his silver pocket watch placed precisely next to his right hand. Every few minutes he would touch it, as if reassuring himself that time was indeed moving forward according to his design. "You'll note," he said, his cultured voice at odds with the predatory gleam in his eyes, "that I've included provisions for your mother's care. The finest doctors in Denver, all expenses paid." Andrew Mitchell's hand trembled as he turned a page. "And the ranch? Absorbed into my holdings, naturally, but you'll be allowed to remain as tenant manager. A generous arrangement, considering the circumstances." Sarah's fingers dug into the wood of her father's chair. Every word from Blackwood's mouth was another chain being forged around them. "Article 7, her father muttered, squinting at the dense text. "Regarding my daughter's personal property." Blackwood's smile didn't waver. "A standard clause. Upon marriage, all of Sarah's current and future possessions transfer to my sole ownership, including, of course, any inheritance she might receive." The implications hung in the air like smoke. Sarah thought of her mother's jewelry, her grandmother's letters, even the small savings account she'd built from selling her embroidery. All of it would become his. "And if I die?" The question slipped out before she could stop it. The room went deadly quiet. Blackwood's fingers stilled on his watch, and for a moment his mask slipped. Something ancient and cold looked out through his eyes. "My dear," he said softly, "why would you ask such a morbid question?" "Curiosity." Sarah held his gaze. "After all, accidents do happen. Isn't that what the newspapers said about your other wives?" "Sarah." Her father half rose, face pale. "Mr. Blackwood, please forgive. No forgiveness needed." Blackwood's smile returned, sharper than before. "A practical question deserves a practical answer. In the event of your death, my dear, all assets revert to me, including the provisions for your mother's care. Article 12 makes that quite clear." The trap snapped shut with audible finality. Even if she died or was killed, her family would remain in Blackwood's power. She had to live, had to endure whatever came, or her death would destroy them, as surely as her refusal. One last detail. Blackwood produced another document from his leather portfolio, a small addendum regarding family visitation. For your own comfort, of course. New brides often find it easier to adjust without distractions. Sarah read the flowing script with growing horror. After the wedding, she would be permitted to see her family only under Blackwood's direct supervision. No unexpected visits. No private conversations, no letters that didn't pass through his hands first. Complete isolation, she whispered. "Complete protection," Blackwood corrected smoothly. "A husband must guard his wife's happiness after all. Signs the papers, Andrew. The hour grows late, and I have other matters requiring my attention." Her father's pen scratched across the paper like a death sentence being written. Sarah watched her future being signed away in flowing black ink, each signature another bar in her cage. Blackwood gathered the contracts with practiced efficiency, tucking them into his portfolio. "I've taken the liberty of having your belongings. Moved to the mansion. New clothes more befitting your station will be provided. My mother's locket," Sarah started, "will make a charming addition to my collection." Blackwood stood, straightening his immaculate jacket. "Until tomorrow, my dear. I trust you'll spend your last night here, reflecting on the importance of wifely obedience." After he left, Sarah remained standing behind her father's chair, her hands white-knuckled on the wood. Outside, Blackwood's carriage pulled away, wheels crunching in the snow. "I'm sorry," her father whispered, his voice breaking. "God help me." "Sarah, I'm so sorry." But Sarah wasn't listening. She was watching Blackwood's carriage disappear into the gathering dusk and calculating how many hours remained until dawn. How many hours before the hangman's noose of that contract would tighten around her neck forever, or until someone stopped it. In the fading light of her last evening of freedom, Sarah knelt before the loose floorboard beneath her bed. Her fingers found the familiar groove, lifting the worn wood to reveal a bundle of letters tied with faded blue ribbon. The paper was soft from countless readings, Jake's bold handwriting carrying echoes of a happiness that seemed to belong to another lifetime. The first letter had been written 3 summers ago, not long after the harvest dance where they'd first admitted their feelings. Sarah unfolded it carefully, the creases well worn from hundreds of secret readings. "Dearest Sarah," she read silently, Jake's voice clear in her mind. "I'm writing this by lamplight, having just returned from seeing you. My hands still remember the feel of yours during our dance, and I find myself unable to sleep, thinking of your smile." A tear splashed onto the page, and Sarah quickly wiped it away. She couldn't afford to damage these letters. They were all she had left of him. Another letter slipped from the bundle, this one dated just weeks before his death. "I have something important to ask you," he'd written. "Something I've been carrying in my heart since the moment we met. When next we meet, I promise you'll understand everything." She'd never learned what question he'd planned to ask that night. His horse had been found the next morning, blood on the saddle, tracks leading to the gorge's edge. Blackwood's men had been the ones to bring the news, their faces properly somber, even as their eyes glittered with something that, looking back now, might have been satisfaction. "My God," Sarah whispered, the realization hitting her like a physical blow. She scrambled through the letters, finding one where Jake had mentioned his suspicions about cattle rustlers, about missing water rights, about strange accidents happening to ranchers who refused to sell to Blackwood. "Something's not right here," he'd written. "People are too afraid to talk, but I'm going to find out why. Don't worry about me, love. I know how to handle myself." Except he hadn't. Or had he? The timing was too perfect. Jake's death just as he was starting to ask questions, followed by the sudden downturn in the Mitchell Ranch's fortunes. Sarah's hands shook as she unfolded another letter, this one containing a pressed wildflower. "Found this up near Miller's Pass," Jake had written. "Reminded me of your eyes, the way they shine when you're laughing. I'm heading up there again tomorrow night. Have something special to show you when I return." Miller's Pass, the same place where he'd allegedly died, the same place that had mysteriously become impassable shortly after, forcing the Mitchells to take longer routes for their cattle drives, bleeding them dry with extra expenses. A floorboard creaked behind her, and Sarah whirled, letters clutched to her chest. Emma stood in the doorway, her young face tight with worry. "Sarah," she whispered, "someone's coming." Riders in the dark. Sarah's heart leaped, then plunged. Blackwood's men? No. Emma crept closer, her voice dropping even lower. "They're being careful, staying in the shadows, but I saw at least 3 of them circling the property." Hope was a dangerous thing, but Sarah couldn't stop it from blooming. She looked down at Jake's letters, at his confident handwriting and passionate words. He'd been investigating Blackwood. He'd been getting close to something important. And then he died, or hadn't died, just when it mattered most. "Help me with these," Sarah said, gathering the letters. "We need to hide them somewhere safer than a floorboard. If Blackwood's men search the house after tomorrow—" Emma took the bundle, but her eyes were sharp with questions. "You think Jake might have—" "I think nothing is what it seems." Sarah replaced the floorboard, her movements precise despite her racing heart. "And I think we need to be ready for anything." Outside, snow continued to fall, thick enough to muffle hoofbeats, to hide approaching riders, to blur the line between what was real and what was merely shadow. Sarah touched the last letter, the one where Jake had promised to explain everything. "You always kept your promises," she whispered to the memory of him. Always. In the distance, a horse nickered softly. the sound almost lost in the wind. Emma's, and found Sarah's in the darkness, squeezing tight. Both sisters stood motionless, listening to the night, to the possibility of hope, to the whispered promises of love letters that might not be just memories, after all. Neither spoke the dangerous thought growing in their minds that sometimes the dead didn't stay dead, that sometimes love was stronger than death itself, that sometimes promises made in passion and sealed with sacrifice found ways to fulfill themselves, even across years and graves and carefully constructed lies. The damaged saddle creaked beneath Jake as he urged his fresh mount forward through the blinding snow. Old Tom Collins had insisted on giving him his best horse, a powerful black stallion that seemed to understand the urgency of their mission. The bullet graze along Jake's ribs had been cleaned and bandaged, but every breath sent shards of pain. Through his chest, "They're watching all the approaches to the Mitchell place," Tom had warned, while his wife Martha tended Jake's wounds. "Blackwood's got at least 20 men out there. They're expecting trouble." Jake touched his father's worn saddle, the leather scarred from years of hard riding, and now bearing fresh bullet holes from the earlier ambush. Good. They won't be disappointed. Now, crouched low over the horse's neck, he guided them through the narrow deer trails he'd hunted as a boy. Blackwood's men would be watching the main roads, but there were older paths through these hills, paths that didn't appear on any map. A twig snapped somewhere to his left. Jake's hand found his Colt. As his mount tensed beneath him, through the swirling snow, shadows moved with purpose. There! A voice carried on the wind, followed by the distinctive sound of rifles being chambered. Jake didn't hesitate. He kicked his horse into a full gallop, bullets whining past like angry hornets. The black stallion responded magnificently, powerful, muscles bunching as they crashed through the underbrush. More shots rang out behind them. Jake felt something hot slice across his left shoulder, but there was no time for pain. He guided the horse down a steep embankment, using the terrain for cover. Cut him off at the creek. The voices were falling behind, but Jake knew these hills too well to believe he'd lost them. They'd be riding for the parallel trail, trying to trap him in the narrow valley ahead. His mind raced through options, each one worse than the last. The creek would be frozen this time of year, possibly thick enough to bear a horse's weight. But if the ice broke, a bullet splintered bark near his head. Time for thinking was over. "Hope you can swim, boy," Jake muttered to his mount, turning them toward the creek. The horse's ears flicked back at his voice but didn't break stride. The creek appeared through the snow like a ribbon of black glass. Jake could hear hooves thundering along both banks now, closing the trap. At the last possible moment, he turned, the horse parallel to the creek instead of crossing it. "What's he doing?" a voice called out in confusion. Jake allowed himself a grim smile. The creek bent sharply ahead, cutting through a narrow canyon. In summer, there was a natural ford there. In winter, with the water low, he's going for the cave! Someone had figured it out. "Stop him!" But it was too late. Jake leaned forward, wrapping his fingers in the horse's mane. "Trust me, boy." They burst through a stand of bare willows, snow exploding around them. The creek vanished into the canyon wall ahead, a dark moor that had terrified Jake as a child. Now it was their only chance. The black stallion didn't even hesitate. They plunged into the darkness, hooves ringing on the frozen creek bed. Behind them, confused shouts echoed off the stone walls. Jake had discovered this passage years ago, hunting with his father. The creek had carved a tunnel through the limestone, emerging a quarter-mile away. In summer it was impassable, filled with rushing water. But in winter, with the creek frozen, they moved slowly now, the horse picking its way carefully through the absolute darkness. Water dripped somewhere ahead, the sound amplified by stone walls. Jake kept one hand on the rough rock beside them, counting his heartbeats, measuring distance. A shot rang out behind them, the sound deafening in the confined space. But the bullet went wide, sparking off stone, and Jake knew they wouldn't try. Again, in this tunnel, the ricochet was as dangerous as the initial shot. "Easy," he whispered to the horse. "Almost there." Light appeared ahead, a grey smudge that slowly resolved into the tunnel's exit. Jake drew his Colt, ready for an ambush, but when they emerged into the snowy afternoon, the valley was empty. They'd done it. This route would bring them to the Mitchell Ranch from the north, through the old forest where Sarah and Jake had once walked together, planning futures that had seemed so certain then. The black stallion was breathing hard but still strong. Jake gave him his head, letting him find the easiest path through the deep snow. The wound in his shoulder throbbed in time with his heartbeat, and the earlier bullet graze felt like fire along his ribs, but none of that mattered now. He pulled out his broken pocket watch, studying the frozen hands. Time might have stopped for him 2 years ago, but it was moving again now, moving toward a confrontation that would either save everything he loved or destroy it completely. Behind them, faint shouts carried on the wind. Blackwood's men would find another way around, would be coming for him with doubled fury now. But they'd lost precious time, and Jake had gained something even more valuable than a lead. He had hope, the kind of desperate, dangerous hope that could change the world or end it. The wedding dress hung in Sarah's room like a ghost, its white fabric luminous in the candlelight. She stood before it, unable to sleep, unable to stop staring at the elaborate gown Blackwood had sent over, a beautiful prison sewn from silk and lace. A soft knock at her window made her heart stop. Emma's face appeared through the frost-covered glass, her eyes wide with urgency. Sarah rushed to let her in, helping her sister climb through from the narrow ledge outside. "You'll freeze to death," Sarah scolded, wrapping a blanket around Emma's shoulders. "Never mind that." Emma pulled a crumpled paper from inside her coat. "One of those riders I saw. He dropped this near the old oak tree. I think it was meant for you." Sarah's hands trembled as she unfolded the note. The handwriting was unfamiliar, but the words made her blood run cold. "The dead don't always stay buried. Be ready. It has to be about Jake," Emma whispered. "Sarah, what if—" A floorboard creaked in the hallway. Both sisters froze as heavy footsteps approached. Emma dove behind the wedding dress just as the door opened, revealing one of Blackwood's men, a raw-boned fellow with cold eyes. "Mr. Blackwood sent me to check the security of the house," he drawled, gaze sweeping the room. "Making sure his bride doesn't get any foolish ideas about running." Sarah clutched the note behind her back, praying the paper wouldn't rustle. "As you can see, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." The man moved closer, and Sarah caught the smell of whiskey on his breath. "Pretty dress," he said, running a calloused hand along the white fabric. "Shame if anything happened to it before. Tomorrow. Is that a threat? Just an observation." His smile showed too many teeth. "Mr. Blackwood likes his possessions perfect, unmarred. Might want to remember that." After he left, Emma emerged from behind the dress, her face pale. "We have to get you out of here." "And go where?" Sarah moved to the window, staring out at the snow-covered landscape. "Blackwood's men are watching every road. If we run, father goes to jail, mother loses her care, and you—" She couldn't finish the thought. Emma grabbed her arm. "But if that note means what we think, if Jake is somehow alive, then he's riding into a trap." Sarah pressed her forehead against the cold glass. "Blackwood's been planning this for years. He won't let anything stop tomorrow's wedding." A horse whinnied somewhere in the darkness, the sound quickly muffled by the falling snow. Both sisters moved to the window, straining to see through the swirling white. "There!" Emma pointed to a shadow moving between the trees. "Someone's out there." Sarah's heart thundered in her chest. The figure was too far away to make out clearly, but something about the way they moved, the set of their shoulders. A shot rang out, shattering the night's silence. The figure disappeared into the shadows as shouts erupted from Blackwood's men posted around the property. "Get him!" a voice called out. "Mr. Blackwood wants him alive!" Sarah gripped the windowsill until her knuckles turned white. More shots followed. Then the thunder of hooves moving away from the house. It was him! Emma breathed. Wasn't it? Before Sarah could answer, their father burst into the room, his face ashen. Get away from the windows, he ordered. Both of you. Father. What's happening? Andrew Mitchell's hands were shaking as he drew the curtains. Nothing that concerns you. The wedding will proceed as planned. He turned to Sarah, his eyes pleading. Promise me you won't do anything rash. Promise me you'll be there tomorrow. Sarah looked at the wedding dress, at the note still clutched in her hand, at her sister's desperate face. Outside, more shots echoed through the night, each one carrying the possibility of destroying her last hope. I'll be there, she said quietly. I promise. But as her father left, Sarah shared a look with Emma. They both knew that promises made under duress were like snow in spring, bound to melt away when the sun rose. Sarah touched the window glass, frost melting beneath her fingers. Somewhere out there in the darkness, a ghost was riding through bullet fire, carrying with him the keys to her cage. She just had to survive until dawn, had to play her part in Blackwood's carefully orchestrated performance, and pray that this time, death itself wouldn't stop love from finding its way home. After the gunshots faded into the night, Sarah couldn't remain still. While Emma kept watch at the window, she lit a candle and crept down to her father's study. If Jake was truly alive, truly coming for her, she needed proof of Blackwood's crimes, something concrete enough to take to the territorial authorities. The study door creaked as she entered, shadows dancing across the leather-bound books and scattered papers that marked her father's decline. A half-empty whiskey bottle stood sentinel on his desk, next to a stack of ledgers she'd never seen before. These weren't her father's familiar account books. The leather was finer, the paper higher quality, and stamped in gold leaf across the spine was a single word: acquisitions. Sarah's hand shook as she opened the first ledger. Inside, in precise handwriting, was a record of destruction so methodical it took her breath away. Miller's Past Land Company, she read silently. Owner, deceased. Accident. Property acquired below market value. Below that entry was a list of payments to sheriffs, judges, newspaper editors. People bought and sold like cattle. Page after page told the same story. Families ruined through mysterious fires, convenient accidents, suddenly called-in loans. Properties acquired for pennies on the dollar, all feeding into Blackwood's empire. Then she found it, the entry that changed everything. Harrison Ranch, owner J. Harrison eliminated. Property pending acquisition through Mitchell default and marriage contract. Sarah's blood turned to ice. There it was in black and white. Jake's death had been just another move in Blackwood's grand game, and her family's ruin, her forced marriage, had been planned from the start. But there was more. The ledger showed a pattern bigger than just land acquisition. Blackwood was building something, a network of properties controlling every major water source, every cattle trail, every route to the railroad. Once the Mitchell ranch was his, he'd have a stranglehold on the entire territory. A floorboard creaked behind her. Sarah whirled, heart in her throat, but it was only Emma. Father's asleep, her sister whispered. But Blackwood's men are getting nervous. They're searching the grounds with lanterns. Sarah held up the ledger. Emma, look at this. Blackwood didn't just kill Jake. He's been orchestrating everything. The bank loans, the water rights disputes, even Mother's doctor suddenly raising his fees. It's all been him. Emma's eyes widened as she scanned the pages. We have to get this to the marshal's office. These aren't just business records, Sarah continued, flipping to newer entries. They're evidence of murder. Look. 3 weeks ago, Judge Harrison died in his sleep, the same judge who was investigating Blackwood's land deals. A horse nickered. Outside, closer than before. Both sisters moved to the window. Through the swirling snow, they could see lanterns moving in a search pattern, Blackwood's men growing increasingly agitated. They're not just looking for Jake, Sarah realized. They're looking for something he took, something that scared Blackwood enough to post 20 armed men around a wedding. Emma grabbed her arm. Sarah, look at this. She pointed to an entry, dated just yesterday. Final preparations complete. Mitchell marriage to proceed. All obstacles to be eliminated permanently. The implications were clear. After the wedding, with Sarah's signature on the marriage contract giving him control of everything, there would be no reason to keep the Mitchells alive. One by one, they would meet with accidents, just like Blackwood's other wives, just like anyone else who stood in his way. Sarah closed the ledger with trembling hands. "We have to—" A sharp whistle cut through the night, 3 short blasts followed by a long one. Emma's face lit up with recognition. "That's Jake's signal, the one he used to use when coming to call." Sarah's heart leapt, then plunged as answering. Shouts erupted from Blackwood's men. Gunfire exploded from multiple directions, and a horse screamed in pain. "We have to help him," Emma pleaded, but Sarah clutched the ledger to her chest, mind racing. "No, this is what we need. If Jake's alive, if he's really a marshal now, like that note suggested, this ledger is enough to bring down Blackwood's entire empire." More shots rang out, closer now. They had to move fast, had to find a way to get this evidence to someone who could use it, had to survive until morning, because now they knew the wedding wasn't just about forcing a marriage, it was about tying up loose ends. Permanently, the old thunder oil lamp cast wavering shadows across the kitchen as dawn approached. Sarah sat at the table, still in her nightgown, watching Emma hide the damning ledger inside a flour sack. They'd spent the rest of the night copying the most crucial pages, creating a second record in case anything happened to the original. "The stage to Cheyenne passes Miller's Creek at noon," Emma whispered, securing the package. "If I can get this to the marshal's office—" "No." Sarah grabbed her sister's hand. "It's too dangerous. Blackwood's men will be watching every road." Then how they fell silent as heavy boots approached the back door. Martha Collins, the wife of the farmer who'd helped Jake, entered carrying a covered basket. Her eyes were wide with fear, but her voice was steady. "Wedding breakfast," she announced loudly, for the benefit of the guards outside. Then, softer, "He made it through the night. Tom's keeping him hidden in the root cellar." Sarah's heart leapt. "He's alive?" Martha began unpacking the basket, her movements deliberately slow. "Wounded, but alive. Says he's got men coming, other marshals, but they won't arrive until afternoon." She glanced at the window, where the first grey light of dawn was creeping over the snow. "The wedding's at 10. Emma clutched the flour sack containing the ledger. "Mrs. Collins, could you—" "Already planned, dear." Martha pulled out a second identical sack. "I'll be delivering flour to every house preparing for the wedding breakfast. No one will question it." Sarah watched as they switched the sacks, her mind racing. Jake was alive. Help was coming. But the timing was wrong. Everything was wrong. The thunder oil lamp flickered as the wind picked up outside, carrying the sound of approaching wagons. The first wedding guests were arriving early, their carriages cutting dark tracks through the fresh snow. "Sarah!" Her father's voice carried down the stairs, tight with strain. "The dress, now!" Martha squeezed her hand before hurrying out with the disguised ledger. Emma gathered up the copied pages, sliding them into her dress pocket. "I'll find a way to delay things," her sister promised. "Maybe if Mother's health takes a turn—" "No!" Sarah stood, steel entering her spine. "No more delays, no more running." She crossed to the window, watching Blackwood's men position themselves around the property. They were trying to be subtle, disguising themselves as wedding security, but she could see the tension in their postures. They were expecting trouble. The thunder oil lamp sputtered again as another gust rattled the windows. A storm was gathering, both outside and in her heart. "Help me with the dress," she told Emma. "Let's give Blackwood exactly what he's expecting." "Sarah, no. Trust me." She managed a small smile. "Sometimes the best way to spring a trap is to step into it willingly." They climbed the stairs together, passing their mother's room, where the doctor was already attending her. The woman's pained coughing felt like physical blows to Sarah's heart, each one a reminder of why she'd agreed to this marriage in the first place. In her room, the wedding dress waited like a shroud, but as Emma helped her into it, Sarah felt something shift inside her. This dress wasn't her prison anymore. It was her armor. "The guards are changing positions," Emma reported, watching through the window as she fastened the tiny buttons. "They're moving closer to the house." "Good." Sarah checked her reflection, noting how the white fabric made her look pale, fragile. "Perfect. Where's the laudanum mother takes for her pain?" Emma's eyes widened. "In the kitchen cabinet." "But get it. And find out which of Blackwood's men takes his coffee strongest." Understanding dawned on her sister's face. "The one by the back door. He's on his third cup already." Sarah nodded, adding pins to her hair. Each one felt like a weapon. "Get the laudanum. Then make sure Martha's basket gets delivered to the right places. And Emma," she turned to her sister, "no matter what happens, stay close to Father. Promise me." The thunder oil lamp downstairs flickered one final time and went out, plunging the kitchen into darkness. But upstairs, the growing dawn lit Sarah's face with cold clarity. She looked like a bride should look. Beautiful, demure, acquiescent. Only, her eyes told a different story. They burned with the same fire that had kept Jake alive through 2 years of waiting, planning, surviving. The same fire that would either save them all or consume everything in its path. The storm was no longer gathering. It had arrived. Andrew Mitchell stood before his dress mirror, fingers trembling as they worked at his tie. The tarnished Army medal, on his chest, earned at Gettysburg 13 years ago, caught the morning light, sending accusatory gleams across the room. "Some things are worth dying for," his commander had said when pinning on that medal. "And some things are worth living, for even when living feels like the harder choice." Now, watching wedding carriages arrive through his window, those words haunted him. He'd sold his daughter to a monster, all in the name of honor, of duty, of survival. A knock at his door revealed Emma, her face pale but determined. "Father, there's something you need to see." She held out several sheets of paper, covered in hasty but precise copying. At first, the numbers meant nothing to him. Then, as he read further, the whiskey glass slipped from his nerveless fingers, shattering on the floor. "Where did you get this?" "It doesn't matter." Emma's voice was firm. "What matters is that it's true, all of it. Blackwood didn't just destroy us, he planned it. Jake's death, Mother's increasing medical bills, the bank calling our loans. It was all him." Andrew sank into his chair, the papers trembling in his hands. Each entry was a death sentence, not just for his family, but for everything he'd ever believed about honor and duty. "Sarah knows. She's the one who found the original ledger." Emma knelt beside him, taking his shaking hands in hers. "Father, we have maybe 2 hours before the wedding. Help is coming, but help." He looked up sharply. "What help?" Before Emma could answer, boots thundered up the stairs. One of Blackwood's men appeared in the doorway, his hand resting casually on his gun. "Mr. Mitchell, boss wants to see you." Andrew stood slowly, letting the papers fall into the fire burning. In his grate, they caught quickly, turning to ash before the guard could see what they were. "Of course." He straightened his medal, feeling its weight like a noose. "Emma, check on your mother." The guard led him downstairs to Blackwood's waiting carriage. The man himself sat inside, impeccable in his wedding suit, a smile playing at his lips. "Andrew, come, share a drink with your soon-to-be son-in-law." A carriage interior smelled of expensive leather and gunpowder. Andrew sat stiffly, accepting the offered whiskey with a hand that barely shook. "Beautiful morning for a wedding," Blackwood continued. "Though I hear there was some excitement last night. Hunters perhaps straying too close to the property? I wouldn't know." "No." Blackwood's smile sharpened. "Strange. I could have sworn I heard shots. Still, no matter. Nothing will spoil this day. I've worked too long, planned too carefully." He leaned forward, all pretense dropping from his voice. You've played your part well, Andrew. The broken-down rancher, the desperate father. You've given me everything I wanted, wrapped up in a white dress with your daughter's pretty face. You're mad, Andrew whispered, the full horror of his choices finally hitting him. Mad? No, I'm a businessman, one who understands that true power comes from controlling not just land and water, but hope itself. Blackwood's eyes glittered. Your daughter gave up everything to save her family. Imagine my surprise when I discovered that the man she truly loved, the man I thought I'd eliminated, is still alive. Andrew's heart stopped. Jake is currently bleeding in Tom Collins's root cellar. Yes, I know all about it, just as I know about the ledger your daughters found, the copies they made, the messages they've been passing. Blackwood sipped his whiskey. Did you really think I didn't have eyes everywhere? If you hurt them, that depends entirely on you. Blackwood pulled out a pocket watch, checking the time. In 2 hours, Sarah will walk down that aisle. She will say her vows, and you will stand beside her, giving your blessing with a smile. If you don't, he shrugged. Well, root cellars can be dangerous places. People fall, necks break. The metal felt like it was burning through Andrew's chest. All those years ago, facing Confederate cannon, he'd known exactly what honor demanded. But now, trapped in this carriage with a devil wearing a gentleman's smile, honor's price had become far more complex. What's it to be, Andrew? Your daughter's hand given freely, or Jake Harrison's death warrant? Choose quickly. The guests are arriving. Outside the carriage, snow began to fall again, thick flakes that would cover all traces of what was to come. Andrew thought of Sarah in her white dress, of Emma with her copied papers, of Jake bleeding in a root cellar, of a medal earned in a war where the enemies had worn uniforms and the choices, while deadly, had been clear. Some things were worth dying for. But what about living with the consequences of an impossible choice? The answer, when it came, tasted like ash in his mouth. Dawn's first light crept across the snow like spilled blood, painting the white landscape in shades of crimson and gold. Sarah watched it from the church window, counting the minutes as they slipped away. The wedding dress felt heavier with each passing moment, its elaborate train spread around her like frozen waves. Emma burst into the small anteroom, cheeks flushed from running. "The ledger made it out," she whispered. "Martha Collins got through. But father—" She stopped, catching her breath. Blackwood took him into his carriage. When he came back, he looked different. Sarah touched the hidden pocket in her dress where she'd sewn the copied pages. Different how? Like a man who's seen his own grave. Emma pressed closer, voice dropping even lower. "And there's more. Tom Collins' boy just rode past. He says Jake's gone." Sarah's heart stuttered. Gone? The root cellar was empty. Blood on the floor, signs of a struggle. Emma's fingers twisted in her dress. "Sarah, what if Blackwood's men—" "No." Sarah turned back to the window. The sun was higher now, burning away the red to leave only cold. Clear light. Jake wouldn't let them take him, not alive. Outside, carriages continued to arrive. Ladies in their finest dresses, gentlemen in dark suits, all come to witness Clayton Blackwood's greatest triumph. None of them knowing they were really here to watch a funeral dressed as a wedding. A soft knock announced the doctor, coming to check on their mother one last time before the ceremony. The man's face was grave as he packed away his instruments. "The laudanum's helping with the pain," he said quietly. "But she's very weak. The journey to Denver, he didn't need to finish. Without Blackwood's money, without the promised treatments, their mother wouldn't survive the week." Sarah felt the weight of that knowledge settle onto her shoulders like a physical burden. "How long until the ceremony?" Emma asked. "Half an hour." Sarah smoothed her dress, checking that the hidden papers didn't show. "Is everything in place?" Emma nodded. "Martha's boy is watching the road for the marshals. The copied ledger is on its way to Cheyenne, and I slipped the laudanum into the coffee just like you said." A commotion outside drew them to the window. Blackwood had arrived, resplendent in a black suit that made him look more undertaker than bridegroom. His men were positioning themselves around the church, their guns hidden but present. "He's not taking any chances," Emma observed. "No." Sarah watched as her father emerged from his carriage, walking stiffly as if aged decades in the past hour. "None of us are." The church bell began to toll, each sound like a hammer driving nails into a coffin. 9 times it rang, marking the hour before the wedding. Sarah counted each one, thinking of Jake somewhere out there in the cold morning light. Miss Mitchell? The seamstress appeared, ready to make final adjustments to the dress. "It's time." Emma grabbed Sarah's hand. "We could still run. Right now, just go out the back and leave Mother, leave Father to face whatever Blackwood's planned." Sarah squeezed her sister's fingers. "No, we play this through, to the end." The seamstress fussed with the train, unaware of the current of tension running through the room. Outside, guests were filing into the church. The organist was beginning. The first hymn. Sarah checked her reflection one last time. She looked exactly as Blackwood wanted, young, beautiful, submissive, the perfect trophy to crown his collection. But underneath the white silk and lace, her heart beat with the warrior's rhythm. "Whatever happens," she told Emma, "stay close to Father. Promise me, Sarah, promise me." Emma nodded, tears bright in her eyes. "I promise." The church bell tolled. Once more, a final warning. Through the window, Sarah caught a glimpse of movement in the tree line, a shadow that might have been a rider, quickly gone. Her heart leaped, then steadied. Time had run out. The next hour would either save them, or destroy everything she loved. But standing there in her white dress, watching dawn's light paint the world in shades of hope and blood, Sarah felt a strange calm settle over her. She was ready to face whatever came next, whether it was salvation or damnation. Ready to meet her fate with the same courage that had kept Jake alive through 2 years of waiting. The church doors opened. The wedding march began to play. It was time. The church bell's final toll hung in the air like a death knell as Sarah took her father's arm. The wedding march echoed through the small church, each note another step toward damnation or deliverance. "I'm sorry," Andrew Mitchell whispered as they waited behind the closed doors. "God help me, Sarah, I'm so sorry." She squeezed his arm in response, feeling the tremors running through his body. Whatever Blackwood had said to him in that carriage had broken something fundamental in her father's spirit. The doors swung open. 100 faces turned to watch her entrance, their expressions a mix of sympathy and curiosity. They all knew of Blackwood's reputation. They'd all heard the whispers about his other wives. Yet here they sat, bearing witness to another sacrifice. Clayton Blackwood stood at the altar like a spider in his web, his smile sharp enough to draw blood. His men were positioned strategically throughout the church, their formal suits doing little to hide the weapons beneath. Sarah counted steps as she walked. 20 to the altar, 19, 18. Through the stained glass windows, she caught glimpses of more armed men outside, watching the surrounding trees. 17, 16. Emma sat in the front pew beside their mother, her face pale but determined. The laudanum-laced coffee should be taking effect on Blackwood's guard by now. 15, 14. The minister shifted uncomfortably, his eyes darting. Between bride and groom. Did he know he was presiding over a murder wrapped in matrimony? 13, 12. A horse nickered outside, quickly silenced. Sarah's heart jumped, but she kept her face carefully blank. At the altar, Blackwood extended his hand. Sarah forced herself to take it, feeling the cold strength in his fingers as they closed around hers like a trap. "Dearly beloved," the minister began, his voice trembling slightly, "we are gathered here today." Sarah let the words wash over her, focusing instead on the subtle changes happening around them. The guard by the side door was blinking heavily, fighting the effects of the drugged coffee. Outside, the wind had picked up, carrying the promise of another storm, if anyone has reason why these two should not be joined. The traditional pause stretched a heartbeat too long. Sarah felt Blackwood's fingers tighten painfully around hers. A warning. Then speak now, or forever hold your... The church doors burst open with enough force to rattle the windows. Snow and wind howled into the sanctuary as a figure appeared in the doorway, silhouetted against the morning light. "I have a reason," Jake Harrison said, his voice carrying to every corner of the church. Blood stained his shirt, but his gun hand was steady as he stepped inside. Several, actually, starting with murder. Chaos erupted. Women screamed as Blackwood's men drew their weapons. The drugged guard by the door tried to raise his gun, but staggered, falling into a pew. Emma pushed their mother down, shielding her. As the first shots rang out, Blackwood yanked Sarah against him, using her white dress as a shield. "Always the hero," he sneered at Jake. "But you're too late. She's mine now. Everything is mine." Not quite. Jake took another step forward. Behind him, more figures appeared, men wearing U.S. Marshal badges. "The territorial authorities have... Your ledger, Clayton. Every murder, every theft, every corrupt deal, all of it documented in your own hand." Sarah felt Blackwood go rigid. His free hand moved to his jacket, toward the gun she knew he carried. "It's over," Jake continued, still advancing. "Your men are surrounded. The judge you thought you'd bought, he's been working with us for months. All we needed was proof." "Proof?" Blackwood laughed, the sound harsh and wild. "You have nothing but paper, and paper burns." It happened faster than Sarah could follow. Blackwood shoved her aside, drawing his gun in one fluid motion. Jake dove left as the shot rang out, returning fire as he rolled. More shots exploded through the church. Sarah scrambled behind a pew as bullets splintered wood around her. Through the chaos, she saw her father moving with purpose, his army training, taking over as he helped the marshals subdue Blackwood's men. "Sarah!" Emma's voice cut through the gunfire. "The lamp!" Sarah looked up to see the massive oil lamp above the altar swaying dangerously, its chain partially severed by a stray bullet. Directly beneath it, Blackwood and Jake were locked in a desperate struggle. Time seemed to slow. Sarah saw the chain beginning to fail, saw Jake's position, saw Blackwood's mad grin as he raised his gun for a killing shot. She didn't hesitate. Gathering her white skirts, she launched herself forward, crashing into both men just as the lamp plunged toward the altar. The world dissolved into fire and chaos, and the church bell began to toll again, marking either an ending or a beginning. But either way, marking change. The smoking gun lay between them like a judgment as flames licked at the altar. Sarah's white dress was smeared with blood and soot, but her hands were steady as she kept Blackwood's own revolver trained on his chest. "Don't," she warned as he shifted, his face a mask of fury and disbelief. "I've watched 3 wives die at your hands. I won't be the 4th. Jake groaned beside her, clutching his shoulder where Blackwood's bullet had grazed him. The falling oil lamp had missed them all, thanks to Sarah's desperate tackle, but its flames were spreading quickly through the church. "You stupid girl," Blackwood spat, blood trickling from a cut above his eye. "You have no idea what you've done. The people I control, the power I wield, is finished." Marshal Thomas Reed strode through the smoke, his badge glinting in the firelight. "Clayton Blackwood, you're under arrest for murder, corruption, and enough other charges to keep you hanging for 3 lifetimes." Outside, gunfire was dying down as the remaining marshals overwhelmed Blackwood's men. Emma appeared through the haze, helping their father evacuate the last of the wedding guests. "The ledger," Blackwood growled, eyes darting between them. "Where is it?" "Safe in Cheyenne," Jake managed, pushing himself to his feet, "along with sworn statements from every judge, banker, and lawman you ever bribed. Your empire's falling, Clayton, 1 brick at a time." Sarah saw the moment Blackwood broke. The careful mask of civilization cracked, revealing something ancient and venomous beneath. He lunged, not for the gun, but for Sarah's throat, fingers curved like claws. The revolver roared in her hands, Time seemed to freeze. Blackwood looked down at his chest, at the spreading red stain that matched the roses in Sarah's ruined bouquet. His lips moved, forming words that might have been a curse or a prayer. Then he fell. Sarah! Jake caught her as her knees buckled, taking the gun from her trembling fingers. "It's over. It's done." Marshal Reed knelt beside Blackwood's body, checking for a pulse. Finding none, he looked up at Sarah with understanding in his weathered face. "Clear case of self-defense," he declared. "Man was wanted for 3 murders. Already, no jury in the territory would say different." The church was filling with smoke now. They helped each other outside, emerging into morning light that seemed impossibly bright after the chaos within. Sarah saw her father holding her mother, saw Emma organizing the shocked wedding guests into impromptu rescue lines to save what they could from the burning building. "The papers," she remembered suddenly. "In my dress are copies," Jake assured her, keeping his arm around her waist. "The originals are safe. We've been building this case for 2 years, Sarah, ever since I survived his first attempt to kill me." She turned to him then, really looking at him for the first time since he'd burst through the church doors. 2 years of scars marked his face, but his eyes were the same, warm, honest, filled with a love that not even death could erase. "You became a marshal," she said softly. "You spent all this time building a case, gathering evidence, finding every person he'd ever wronged and getting them to testify." Jake touched her face gently. "I couldn't come back until I knew I could protect you, really protect you." Sarah leaned into his touch, feeling the weight of years of fear and obligation falling away. Behind them, the church continued to burn, sending sparks into the winter sky, like desperate prayers finally answered. Andrew Mitchell approached slowly, his army medal glinting in the firelight. "Jake," he said, voice rough with emotion. "Son, it's all right, sir." Jake extended his hand. "We all did what we had to do." Sarah watched her father take Jake's hand, saw the moment of understanding pass between them. The past couldn't be undone, but perhaps it could be forgiven. A commotion near the road drew their attention. 3 of Blackwood's men were trying to escape on horseback, only to ride straight into a line of newly arrived marshals. Among them, Sarah recognized Tom Collins and his son, who had helped maintain Jake's cover all these months. "Miss Mitchell," Marshal Reed approached, holding out a familiar object. "Found this in Blackwood's coat, thought you might want it back." Her mother's locket gleamed in his palm, its silver surface reflecting the flames of the burning church. Sarah took it with trembling fingers, feeling its familiar weight, no longer a burden of obligation, but a symbol of love freely given and devotion freely returned. The church bell, miraculously intact, tolled one final time before the tower, collapsed in a shower of sparks, but its sound no longer carried doom. Instead, it rang with promise, with redemption, with the end of one chapter and the beginning of another. Truth had been revealed, justice had been served, and love against all odds had survived. The broken chains from Blackwood's private office lay scattered across Marshal Reed's desk, physical proof of the man's cruelty. Each link represented another life bound by debt, fear, or false obligations. Sarah touched one of the heavy iron cuffs, remembering the similar weight of her wedding dress. "Found these in a hidden room behind his study," Reed explained, his voice heavy with disgust, "along with proof of at least 5 more murders we didn't know about. Man kept trophies." Jake stood at the window of the marshal's office, watching as more of Blackwood's men were led to the jail. His wounds had been properly bandaged now, but he still moved stiffly. "How deep did his organization go?" "Deep enough to keep us busy." For months." Reed shuffled through papers on his desk. "Judges, bankers, lawmen, half the territory was in his pocket. But your evidence, combined with Sarah's copies of the ledger, gives us everything we need to clean house." Sarah looked up, sharply. "The other families, the ones he ruined like he tried to ruin us. What happens to them?" "Justice, finally." Reed's weathered face softened. The territorial governor's already signed orders returning stolen properties, your father's ranch included. Outside, snow was falling again, covering the ashes of the burned church. Sarah watched it blanket the town in clean white, nature's way of washing away the morning's violence. Speaking of your father, Jake said quietly, he's waiting to talk to you. Andrew Mitchell stood in the street below, looking older but somehow lighter, as if Blackwood's death had lifted years of guilt from his shoulders. Emma was with him, along with Tom Collins and his wife Martha. Go on, Reed encouraged. We've got your statement. The rest can wait. Sarah descended the marshal's office steps slowly, each step carrying her further from the nightmare of the past months. Her father met her at the bottom, his eyes red-rimmed but clear. The doctor's with your mother, he said without preamble. The stress of this morning, but he says she's stable, and with Blackwood's assets being seized, there's money for her treatment. Real treatment, not just buying time. Father, let me finish. He held up a hand, voice rough with emotion. I believed protecting this family meant compromising with evil, making deals with devils. I was wrong. He touched his army medal, now cleaned of soot and blood. Honor isn't about preserving appearances. It's about standing up, when standing up costs you everything. You did stand up, Emma interjected. At the end, when it mattered, we all saw you helping the marshals. Sarah watched her father absorb this, saw him straighten slightly. Some debts can't be repaid, he said finally, but some can. Jake is right here, Jake said, joining them in the street, and wants you to know that the past is past. We look forward now. The chains clinked in Sarah's pocket as she shifted, reminding her of all they'd broken free from. But freedom she was. Learning carried its own price. The burned church, the shattered illusions, the knowledge that evil could wear a gentleman's smile and hide behind legitimate business. The bank's sending someone tomorrow, her father continued, to formally release our loans. The ranch is ours again, free and clear. And the water rights? Sarah asked. Restored, Jake smiled, along with access to the old cattle trails. By spring, you'll be able to start rebuilding the herd. Tom Collins stepped forward then, his honest face concerned. You'll need help with that rebuilding. Martha and I, well, we've been talking. Our boys are good with cattle. If you're looking for partners... Sarah saw her father's eyes widen. At the possibility of redemption, of a future not bound by debt and desperation. That's generous, Tom. More than generous after everything. After you helped save the territory from a murderer? Martha Collins smiled warmly. I'd say we're the ones in your debt. The snow continued to fall as they talked, making plans, rebuilding bridges. Sarah felt Jake's arms slip around her waist, anchoring her in this new reality where choices were truly choices and love didn't wear the face of sacrifice. Marshal Reed wants me to stay on, he murmured in her ear. Help clean up what's left of Blackwood's organization. But I thought maybe I could work from here. The territory could use a local law presence after everything that's happened. Sarah turned to him, seeing the question in his eyes. The same question he'd carried to Miller's Pass 2 years ago, before death and duty had torn them apart. Ask me, she whispered. Jake's smile bloomed slow and sure as the dawn that had started this remarkable day. From his pocket he withdrew a simple gold ring, not Blackwood's ostentatious diamond, but a band that spoke of honest love and promised tomorrows. And there, in the falling snow, surrounded by family and friends and the ashes of their broken chains, he did. The new day's light streamed through the Mitchell ranch house windows, illuminating a kitchen table covered with papers, plans, and possibilities. 2 weeks had passed since the failed wedding, and each sunrise seemed brighter than the last. Sarah sat with Jake, Emma, and her father, reviewing the latest letters from families touched by Blackwood's crimes. Each envelope contained a story, of loss, but also of restoration. Properties returned, debts forgiven, justice, slow but steady, working its way through the territory. The Hendersons got their mill back, Emma read from one letter, and the Wilsons' grazing rights were restored. They're talking about pooling resources, helping each other rebuild. That's what he never understood, Jake said, his arm resting comfortably around Sarah's shoulders. You can break people individually, but give them hope, and they'll rebuild. Together, through the window, Sarah could see Martha Collins directing her sons as they helped repair the Mitchells' north fence. Other neighbors had been appearing daily, offering help, sharing resources, rebuilding more than just physical structures. Dr. Matthews sent word about Mother, Andrew Mitchell added, his face lighter than it had been in years. The new treatments are working. He says she might even be strong enough to travel by spring. Sarah touched the simple gold ring on her finger. Not a chain binding her to obligation, but a promise freely given and joyfully accepted. Jake had proposed properly that snowy day, and she had answered with all the love that 2 years of separation had only strengthened. Marshal Reed's report came in, Jake said, pulling out an official-looking document. Final count of Blackwood's organization runs to over 50 people across 3 territories. Every day brings more evidence, more connections, and more healing, Sarah added, thinking of the families she'd visited over the past weeks. Women who had lost husbands to Blackwood's schemes, children who would now inherit their rightful legacy. Each story another thread in a tapestry of recovery. A horse's whinny drew their attention outside. Tom Collins was arriving with more neighbors, their wagons loaded with lumber and supplies. The burned church would be rebuilt, not as a monument to power and false promises, but as a true sanctuary. We found something else in Blackwood's papers, Jake continued, his voice softening. Proof that he was behind the attacks on other marshals who got too close. Good men died because they didn't have enough evidence, enough support. Sarah squeezed his hand, knowing he carried the weight of those losses. But you found a different way, built alliances, gathered proof, learned patience, he agreed, smiling. At her, had something worth waiting for. Emma made a show of rolling her eyes at their display, but her own smile was bright. She had grown in these weeks, stepping into her strength, helping coordinate the community's recovery efforts. There, Father cleared his throat. Speaking of building things, he spread out a map of the ranch. Tom Collins and I have been talking. With the water rights restored and the new breeding stock coming in, we could expand, create something bigger than just surviving. Sarah studied the map, seeing not just boundaries and pastures, but possibilities. The ranch could become a center for the community's rebirth, a place where broken things were mended and new dreams took root. We'll need a proper foreman, her father continued, looking meaningfully at Jake, someone who knows the law and the land. And a wedding, Emma added innocently. A real one this time, in the new church, once it's built. Outside, more wagons were arriving. Families bringing food, supplies, and helping hands. The winter snow was melting, revealing green shoots beneath, nature's own promise of renewal. Sarah moved to the window, watching her community come together. 2 weeks ago, these same people had gathered to witness what they thought was a triumph of power over justice. Now they gathered to rebuild, to restore, to create something stronger than fear. You know, Jake said, joining her at the window, when I first started hunting Blackwood, I thought justice meant punishment, taking him down, making him pay. And now I think real justice looks more like this. He gestured to the scene outside. People helping people, building something better than what was lost. Sarah leaned into him, feeling the steady beat of his heart. Through the window, she could see her father showing Tom Collins the ranch plans, their heads bent together in shared purpose. Emma was organizing the women bringing food, her natural leadership shining through. The morning light caught something metal in the garden, the last link of Blackwood's chains, half buried in thawing earth. Soon, spring flowers would cover it, completely, transforming a symbol of bondage into soil for new growth. We're not just rebuilding, Sarah said softly. We're growing something new, something stronger. And in the dawning light of possibility, that promise felt as solid as the ring on her finger and as endless as the love in her heart. 1 month later, Sarah stood before a different mirror in a different white dress. This one was simpler, adorned, not with expensive lace, but with wild flowers from the meadow where she and Jake had first fallen in love. Her mother's wedding ring, restored from Blackwood's collection of trophies, sparkled on her finger alongside Jake's engagement band. The new church still smelled of fresh-cut pine, its walls built by the same community that had watched the old one burn. Through the window, Sarah could see the last of the winter snow melting away, revealing the first green promises of spring. "Ready?" Emma appeared in the doorway, radiant in her bridesmaid's dress. "Everyone's waiting, and I mean everyone." Half the territory showed up, it was true. The church was filled beyond capacity, with people spilling out onto the newly built porch. Families who had suffered under Blackwood's reign had come to celebrate not just a wedding, but a rebirth. Mothers feeling strong enough to stay for the whole ceremony, Emma continued, helping Sarah with her flowers. "Dr. Matthews says it's the best she's looked in months." Sarah touched the locket at her throat, no longer a reminder of obligation, but a symbol of love, freely given and joyfully returned. Through the door, she could hear the buzz of conversation, punctuated by occasional laughter. Such a different sound from the tense whispers at her last wedding. Her father's knock was gentle. When she turned to face him, his eyes were clear and proud. The Army medal on his chest caught the light, but it no longer seemed to weigh him down. "Jake's waiting," he said softly, "and this time for all the right reasons." The wedding march began to play, but this was no funeral dirge. Sarah took her father's arm, feeling strength rather than resignation flow between them. They had chosen to keep some of the traditional words, but their meaning had been transformed. "Who gives this woman?" was no longer a transfer of property, but a celebration of family love. "Until death do us part" was not a threat but a promise, made stronger by having faced death and emerged victorious. Jake stood at the altar in his marshal's best, his badge catching the light from the new stained glass windows. Tom Collins stood beside him as best man, while his wife Martha beamed from the front pew. The Collins family's support had helped make this day possible in more ways than one. Marshal Reed sat near the back, his presence a reminder that justice hadn't ended with Blackwood's death. Every week brought new progress in dismantling the corrupt network, restoring stolen properties, rebuilding broken lives. Sarah reached the altar just as a shaft of sunlight broke through the clouds, sending rainbow patterns dancing across the simple wooden cross. Jake took her hands, and in his eyes she saw not just love but partnership, understanding, the strength that came from facing darkness together and emerging into light. They had written their own vows, words that spoke of more than duty and obedience. They spoke of trust earned and faith tested, of love that could survive death itself, of the courage to fight not just for each other, but for justice, for community, for the chance to build something greater than themselves. When the minister pronounced them husband and wife, the cheers that erupted were for more than just a marriage. They were celebrating hope restored, evil overcome, love triumphant. At the reception, held in the newly repaired Mitchell barn, Sarah watched her communities merge and strengthen. Ranch families mingled with marshals, sharing stories and plans. In for the future. Her mother, sitting in a place of honor, had color in her cheeks and light in her eyes that no amount of expensive Denver treatments could have provided. Jake found her by the barn door, where she stood watching the sunset paint, the sky in colors of promise. "Happy?" he asked, drawing her close. Sarah touched her new ring, then the locket that carried her family's legacy. "Happy," she agreed, "and free." They danced under stars, just beginning to emerge, their steps carrying them into a future built not on fear and obligation, but on love and trust, and the strength that comes from facing darkness together. The last light of day caught Sarah's ring, sending sparks of gold across the gathering darkness. Not chains, but choices. Not duty, but devotion. Not an ending, but a beginning. And as night fell soft and sweet over the celebrating community, the promise of dawn waited in their hearts, ready to light whatever path they chose to travel together.